Okay, we're here with Gary Moncrief, and the students will be familiar with your voice in their head, Gary, already because they're reading your book for the class. So they're familiar with your writing voice anyway. But thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I always start by asking people tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in this kind of job. Of course, you're recently retired, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Not even very recently anymore. I retired, fully retired in May of 2019. I had actually partially retired about 5 years before that. So it's been a while. I came to Boise in 1976 as an assistant professor and was basically taught here off and on for 43 years. So I saw this place change a lot.
Yeah. How many students were there here when you got here?
There were 7,000, and Boise State had just come out of junior college status about 5 or 6 years before, and was Boise State College. And then I think the year I came is the same year that Greg Raymond and Dick Kinney came. I think we changed to university status that year, or maybe the year before, but it was not very long. It had not been very long before it was basically a junior college, and so there were obviously a lot of growing pains at first, but it's amazing to think back at how much this place has changed and how much it's developed and how strong an institution it is now compared to what it was like when I first came here.
The Broncos were playing in the Big Sky when you got here?
Yes, the Big Sky. And I'm trying to think if there was another that, well, of course later became there was the Big West, but yeah, it was, I think the year I came here, they had just joined the Big Sky a couple of years before that. Mm-hmm. Obviously they couldn't join it when it was a junior college. So yeah, it's remarkable changes. For your students, I think this is just a great place to be studying public policy. I mean, you're in the state capitol. I used to tell my students that if you think about it, there's not more than just a handful of schools in the United States where you are within a mile of the state capitol. And so if you're going to do public policy, there's not a lot of better places to be. You can get some real hands-on experience, and you can literally go downtown and see what's happening at the legislature and the Capitol at any given time. So I think it's one of the great advantages of Boise State is to be in not only the largest city in the state, but also the state capitol.
Well, it's certainly one of the things that drew me to it. I thought that as a state and local kind of person and interested in urban things as well, the largest city in the state and state capital and an interesting city to boot. So
and more interesting all the time.
Yeah, that's right. So our topic today is about redistricting and how it works in states and how Idaho has chosen to do it. Maybe can you give us like a short version of the history of that?
Yeah. Let's just make it clear. I'm sure your students realize this, but I always start this discussion by making a distinction between reapportionment and redistricting. Yeah. Because the terms are often used kind of interchangeably in the United States, and they're not technically the same thing, although usually you can figure out from the context what the person's talking about. Reapportionment is actually literally about reapportioning, dividing up the U.S. House of Representatives. Because that has to be changed every 10 years, and because there are only 435 seats in that set, that means that when one state gets a new seat, somebody else is losing a seat. So reapportionment is a very different animal in that it's a zero-sum game. And not only do you reapportion in Congress, in the U.S. House, but then you have to redistrict, which is the actual drawing of the lines from, to change them to reflect the population changes. There is a chart that I think is worth looking at. It's the one that shows congressional reapportionment and regional shifts. It's probably looks like it's about the sixth chart down, or sixth or seventh one. Yeah, that one.
Mm-hmm.
So if your students can see this, what this shows is the shift in the U.S. House of Representatives over time in terms of regional strength. The green line and the kind of orangish line right above it, that's the Midwest and the eastern regions of the U.S. And you see those two lines are almost exactly the same. They started fairly high in terms of the number of seats, and over the course of almost a century now, the number of seats has declined substantially. And that's not because those areas are losing population, it's because the other two areas, which is the South, which is the top line, and then the purplish line or blue or whatever that is at the bottom, that's the Western states. Those two have grown so much in population, and a lot of that is, kind of shifting of people from the Midwest. It's the classic, Rust Belt to Sun Belt movement in the United States. And it's very evident, I think, from this chart that there has been a big change over the course of the last century, and really over the course of the last 40 or 50 years, in the number of seats held by South and West compared to the number of seats by the East and the Midwest. So that's reapportionment at work right there. Is every time the West or the South gains a seat, somebody else, the East or the Midwest, loses a seat. And we're going to see that again next year, where we are likely to see 8 to 10 seats shift. Almost all of them will shift to the South and the West, and almost all of them will shift away from the East, and one or two from the Midwest. So that's reapportionment. Redistricting is the actual drawing, pencil line drawing. Old line pencil, you don't do that anymore. It's all done by computer, but that's the actual redrawing of the lines. And the reason you have to do that is because you have to have roughly the same number of people in every district after the census. So this is an exercise that gets done every 10 years, usually in the 2 year of a decade. So we're in the 0 year, obviously. 2020, 2021 is when the census data gets released, and most state legislatures or commissions, whoever's drawing the lines in that state, will do that, and they'll go into effect for the 2022 election. So this is an important election year for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that it sets the decision makers in the states where the legislature makes this decision, which is most of the states. It determines which party is going to control that process. So that's redistricting. And so at the state level, you're almost always talking not about reapportionment, you're talking about redistricting, because the states don't change the number of seats they have in the legislature very often, and almost always that requires a state constitutional amendment to make that kind of change. So basically you're talking about changing the number of, you're changing the lines to reflect the population changes.
And Idaho's probably experiences one of the highest rates of change in terms of population shifts of any of the states.
Certainly in the last couple of decades, that's the case. Again, this is reflective of the West and the South. We've got all this population growth, and that means those areas are going to have to see more adjustment in the lines than is true in the East and the Midwest. In some of the Midwestern states, the population is fairly stagnant, and it's not moving around that much. So, you have to change the lines to reflect the variation, but not nearly as much as you have to change the lines elsewhere. One of the things that I think we mentioned in this PowerPoint stuff is that in the redistricting process is especially different in the West. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is that the growth, there's such rapid growth in the West. So, in Idaho, you're talking about several 100,000 more people. Yeah, there you go. The 6 factors that make redistricting different in the West, substantial population growth. Now, this was actually, that statement was based on the last census, because we don't have the new census, but you can pretty much guarantee it's going to look very similar to that. the states that are growing the fastest: Texas, Florida, Idaho, um, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. So you're going to see the same kind of thing here, where you've got this big population growth in western and in a few southern states. The other thing, one of the other things that makes it particularly difficult in the West is that in the West, state legislative chambers tend to be very small compared to the rest of the country. I think everybody knows, the old thing about New Hampshire has 400 members of the House of Representatives. That's crazy in New Hampshire. Vermont has 150. There's several states. Pennsylvania has 205 in their House of Representatives. So there's a number of states in the South and in the East that have very large legislative chambers. That's not true in the West. Most of the legislative chambers in the West are actually quite small. The largest is Montana, of all places, where there's 50 senators and 100 members of the House, but all the others are really quite small. Idaho, it's 35 in the Senate, 70 in the House. And we may get a chance to talk a little later about how there was potential to change that, but it didn't happen this year. And then you've got states like Oregon. You've got 30 senators and 60 members of the House in Oregon. Same thing is true in Arizona. Nevada is 21 in the Senate and 42 in the House. So you're talking about small chambers here. And then you have very large geographic areas. The western states tend to be very big compared to the southern states or the eastern states. Our son now lives in Rhode Island. Well, Rhode Island is literally smaller than Ada County. So, you compare that to what you find in the West. So 11 of the 13 largest states in terms of square miles are in the West. So there's 3 of the components. And then if you go to the next slide, I think it'll talk about the other factors. The fourth one is that direct democracy, that is the initiative process, is something that's very common in the West. As I'm sure your students know, you guys are reading about that. It's not the case in a lot of places. In the South, there's very few states that have the initiative process. Arkansas and Florida and 1 or 2 others perhaps, but that's it. And in the East, there's very few states that have it. It's very much a Western phenomena. Basically, half of the states that have the initiative process are Western states. Also, because of that, because of the initiative process, Western states are much more likely to have independent redistricting commissions, including Idaho, because those commissions are usually driven through the initiative process. Because legislators aren't going to do it themselves. They don't like to give up that kind of power. And then the demographics are different in the West compared to other places. So you add up all those things and it leads to a very different kind of redistricting process in the West. If you think about the fact that you have small chambers, that means you have fewer legislative districts, but you have large geographic areas to cover. That means that when you get these population shifts, it can change the lines dramatically. A lot of people are aware of the fact that in Idaho, there's one district right now, District 8 in particular, that's known as the helicopter district. District 8 runs almost from the Oregon border. It runs from a little west of Emmett. It runs from almost the Oregon border all the way across the Sawtooths into Salmon. It's about 200 or 250 miles wide. Most of that, there's nobody there. It's mostly wilderness area. But think about trying to represent that district for somebody. There's literally no way to drive from the western point of that district to the eastern point of that district and stay in the district. You either have to go all the way down around through Mountain Home and, like people go to Sun Valley, or you have to fly. That's why it's called the helicopter district. There are some districts in Idaho that are that district, in fact, is larger than, I think I calculated once, it's larger than 8 states. So it's very different than what you find in a lot of states, particularly in the Midwest or the South, where you have pretty big districts. Pretty big numbers in the state legislature, but the states are geographically fairly small. So the districts just aren't as big to get around in as they are in many places in the West.
So it seems like you're going to have increasingly large numbers of districts that have to have at least a part of Ada and Canyon County in them.
Right. What you're going to get, let me kind of amend that. You're going to get more and more districts because of where the growth is in Idaho right now. You're going to get more and more districts that are centered in Ada, Canyon, and Kootenai counties in particular, with a little bit more in Twin and maybe Bannock or Bonneville. But you're going to get fewer and therefore larger rural districts. And that becomes a real challenge to try to represent in those districts. Now, the point you made about it have to be at least part in the county. One of the stipulations in the Idaho Constitution is that counties should be split when you're doing redistricting as little as possible. And the the state Supreme Court has taken that stipulation very seriously. And basically, if the redistricting commission comes up with a plan and it cuts, let's say, 7 counties, because you've got to get the right number of people in the districts, and it cuts 7 counties, and somebody else can come up with a plan that cuts 5 counties, the court is very likely to look seriously at throwing out that first plan and adopting the second one. So this is a major consideration in Idaho now, is what's the court likely to accept based in part on this issue about cutting as few county boundaries as possible when you're doing the redistricting.
And the reason we jump ahead to what is the court going to approve is because every year it gets challenged, correct? Every time we do it.
There are very few things that are sure in life. One of the things that is sure is that when you redistrict, somebody's going to sue. It's just, it's going to happen. So, somebody's going to be unhappy. Somebody's going to sue. You've just put up this this chart that shows the number of the number of challenges in Idaho. This goes back to 1964. Of course, the whole reapportionment / redistricting thing, started in the 60s with Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims. These are the Idaho particular cases. And the first one was Hearn v. Smiley, which was in 1964. And the state legislature came up with a plan, and it was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. It was part of the compilation of cases that were being heard from around the states at that point under the rubric of Reynolds v. Sims. So it's not surprising that case was struck down, because so many state legislative cases were struck down in the 60s as the court was getting fairly aggressive about addressing this particular issue. Mm-hmm. And then in the 70s, there was another plan, as there would be every decade now, Summers v. Santa Rosa. That plan was also struck down. That one was struck down, I believe, also by the federal courts. Heller v. Santa Rosa was a mess in the 80s, where we went through a very tedious, long, drawn-out redistricting process, and the state Supreme Court actually struck down the plan that the state legislature had come up with, and that kind of bounced back and forth between the state and the district court, and eventually the state Supreme Court said, no, this isn't going to work, and they adopted a plan that was actually drawn by the litigants, by the people who had challenged the original redistricting. All of those were struck down for exceeding the population deviation that was allowable. I think we should point out at this point that standard of how much variation can you have between districts as you draw the new lines based on the new population census figures is about 10% in state legislative races. In congressional districts within a state, it's much smaller. The standard is about 1%, actually less than 1%. But for the state legislative districts, the courts have allowed a little more latitude. So we're usually talking about 5% above or 5% below whatever the ideal population. And we can see a little later what I'm projecting the ideal populations to be in Idaho after the 2021 census comes out, after the 2020 census comes out in 2021.
Okay. Um, by the way, this Heller versus Santa Rosa, is that where we ended up with the floterial
Yeah,
districts?
yes. That the floterial district, the 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 plaintiffs in the case were basically some people from northern Idaho, and one of the people that worked hard on this was a guy named Tony Stewart, who was a political scientist at Northern Idaho College. I think you knew Tony probably, and um, Tony and I forget who the other person was. It might have been Sid Duncan, but I'm not sure. At any rate, the people that there is basically a couple of political scientists in northern Idaho devised this plan with floterial. The floterial district, we don't have time or inclination to go into floterial districts. They're really convoluted and confusing, and to be honest, I think it was a horrible proposal. But if anybody's interested, it actually would make a really interesting paper to write. And there are still a couple of states that use floterials a little bit, but it's a very obscure solution to this problem of trying to accommodate the state constitutional aspect about counties with the federal aspect about population variation. And, I don't want to go into it any more than that. It'll depress me and make everybody else's head spin.
Okay. Well, I see we still have had some, we still have gone to court over the,
every time. There's always a court challenge. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's interesting about Idaho, can you back up the slide just before that? So you'll notice there's one missing here. There's 83, 84. Okay, that's the 80s. And then if you go to the next slide, we jump to 2001. So what happened in the 1990s? There was no suit. Yes, there was a suit. There's always a suit, but it was not upheld. The suit was the plan was upheld. The suit was dismissed. That suit in the 90s was brought by the Idaho Hispanic Coalition, and their argument, which I think has some merit, but it was not enough to sway the court. Their argument was that the way Idaho was doing their redistricting was diluting the voting strength of the Hispanic minority, particularly in Canyon County and Minidoka. But frankly, it wasn't as strong a case as I think it might be now, to be blunt about it.
Okay.
Just because of the way the numbers have changed over time.
Yep. So should we jump to how the commission is,
sure.
How we got it and then what it looks like?
Sure. So after the floterial thing, that I guess I should explain a little bit about the floterial thing, even though I've written a lot about the floterial thing, but now I don't even want to read about it. So I'm not suggesting anybody else do. It's very complicated, but basically what happened is we wound up expanding the size of the legislature. We went from 105 to 126. That's we went from 70 in the House to 84, I think it was. And that's right. So 84. So what we did is we added these kind of super districts, which would kind of float over other districts, hence the term floterial. So it created a larger legislature, and it led to a situation where some people were representing 35, 40,000 people, and some people were representing a much larger number than that. And it's a very convoluted logic behind how that could happen. But basically, it was a system that virtually nobody liked. The people were confused by it. The legislators didn't like it. It meant some legislators had to run in much larger districts than others because they were basically running in multi-member districts. It was a mess. Nobody liked it. So what happened was a number of state legislators in the early 90s decided that the solution to this would be to take the whole process away from the legislature, give it to the people through a redistricting commission, And the bargain that would be struck is we would go back to the original system, which was basically somewhere close to 35 districts, 70 House members, 35 in the Senate, and get rid of flotorials. So that was kind of like the devil's bargain that was made, was to get rid of these flotorials, we need to change how we do the whole process. And that system got tremendous support from the legislature. I think it was 70% in each chamber or even greater. And the general public was thrilled with it. 64% of the public voted for that in the constitutional amendment process. So that's how we wound up with the commission in Idaho. Was I like to say we have a commission thanks to flotorial districts. So we've had a redistricting commission now since the 1990s in Idaho. And the way it works, the way it was originally formulated and was set into the Constitution through the amendment is, as you have on the slide there. 6 members are chosen. 3 members are chosen by Republican leaders. That's the majority leader, the minority leader, and the director of the state party, executive director of the state party, or the something like that. And the same thing for the Democrats. So you have the leader and the state party leader. They each choose one person. And then those 6 people, 3 Rs, 3 Ds, are the commission. And it's their job to take all the testimony, go through all the plans that are created, look at all the numbers that come out of the census, and to devise a plan. And the plan has to have at least 4 members in agreement. So that's a simple majority, obviously. But the key thing is because there's 3 and 3, and you need 4, by definition, it becomes a bipartisan agreement. At least one person from one party has to agree. Mm-hmm. So, and then they've got 90 days to agree on a plan from when the commission goes into effect. And if they can't come to an agreement, then a new commission is convened. And then once they come up with a plan, that's going to get challenged. It always does. So several of them have been struck down by the courts, usually on fairly narrow grounds. That is, this plan is okay, except it cuts, Power County where it doesn't need to, or something like that. And so they usually can come up with, an amended plan that works. Last time it was a little stickier than that, and we don't really have time to go into all that. But basically, it's a system that has worked at least as well, and I would argue better than the old system. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are now about 15, 16 states that have independent commissions that do the redistricting, and there's a big push in states to get more of that. Now, as I mentioned before, almost all of those happen to be states with the initiative process, because this is a process that's going to generally, it wasn't in Idaho, it was done through the legislature, but for weird reasons, in most states, this push comes from somebody in the general public, and they do it through the initiative process. That's the case in Arkansas right now. They have an initiative on the ballot for November to change to an independent commission.
Now, I see the next slide is talking about a GOP plan.
Yeah, so this did not come to pass, and I'm very thankful for that, because I was very much opposed to it. There was a proposal that began in 2018 in the Republican State Convention. The argument basically was, hey, wait a minute, we've got overwhelming majority of Republican elected officials in this state, but we don't control the redistricting process. We need to change that. So the argument was we need a 7th member to break the tie, basically. And there was also some talk about changing the number of legislative districts. As most of your students know, in Idaho, there are currently 35 districts. The state constitution says you have to have between 30 and 35 districts, and we have 1 senator and 2 reps per district. So if you have 35 districts, you got 35 senators and 70 reps. That's been the case now for several decades. So there was some talk about maybe expanding the number of districts to as many as 40. And the reason for this argument was because of what we've already talked about, the fact that the rural districts are getting so large that it becomes kind of unmanageable to campaign, and B, to represent. So there was some talk about maybe expanding the number of districts to 40. Both of these things would require a constitutional amendment. Mm-hmm. And so there was a good deal of talk about that. In 2018, this was proposed in there was a resolution proposed, because it would be a constitutional amendment in the House, the Idaho House. The Democrats immediately started to filibuster because it was kind of brought on by surprise. Anyway, the Republicans backed off of that, but it was pretty clear it was going to come back in 2019. And so there was going to be some resistance to that as well. That plan, I think you had the students read the Blue Review piece I did. That piece I wrote that just at the beginning of the session this year. At that point, it was, all the rumor was that there was going to be a new approach. And so that's what I'm talking about. The reality is it never happened. They never brought it to the floor. I think for a lot of reasons. One is there was a great deal of resistance, obviously, from the Democrats. There was some resistance from people outside. And then they got all hung up with COVID, and so it just kind of never happened. I think there was some disagreement within the Republican caucus, particularly in the House, about whether to even whether to try this or not, given all the other things that were going on. So, from my point of view, thankfully, it never came about.
So you have some projections on the what you think might happen.
So yeah, these are projections I made based on this kind of weird methodology where I looked at it. Your students can go and look at the Secretary of State's website. You can go in and find the legislative districts, and you can find the registered voters per district. And obviously registered voters is not the same as population. But what I did is I went back to the 2010, 2011, I guess, maybe 2012, and looked at those numbers of registered voters per district. And then I looked at the population for those districts, because this was right after redistricting. So we knew what the population was in every district at that point. And so, excuse me, I calculated the percentage of the population that was registered to vote, because that's going to be very different in different places. Obviously, you have non-citizens in some districts. That's a larger percentage. You have some districts where you have a lot more adults than children, and some where you have more children than adults. So anyway, it's a rough measure. So if we extrapolate from those numbers, you can kind of get a ballpark figure. So you can look at registration figures all the way up until last month, right? Mm-hmm. So they're on the Secretary of State's website under the voting statistics. So if you look at the district numbers, you'll see they're very different right now. There are some states that have basically 40,000 registered voters, and some states that have about 22 or 23,000. Mm-hmm. So based on that, based on extrapolating from the figures from 2011 or 12, you can guess at what the actual population is, because that's what the census is looking at. They're not looking at registered voters, they're looking at population. So my guess is that the state is going to have about 1.82 million. Mm-hmm. It might be a little higher, because there's I live in Eagle, and I've got so many new neighbors coming in here. It's just amazing. It's amazing, the growth in the last year here, and in Meridian, and in Cuna. So the number actually may be a little bit higher than 1.82, but that's my guess. This is as of 6 or 7 months ago. If that's the case, and if you have 35 districts, which they're going to have because they didn't change the constitutional component, I take that back. There was one change, and the change was to set that at 35. Instead of it being a range of 30 to 35, 35. So we will have 35 districts. If you do the math, you take 35 divided into 1.82, you get 52,000. That's the ideal population per district after the next census, as I'm estimating. Now, you get a 5% above or beyond. Excuse me. I'm going to get a drink of water here. So if you do the math, you get 5% above or beyond. Every district's going to have something like 49,500 to 54,500. That's the range. Okay, so the next chart you're not even going to be able to read very well. It's if you can somehow get that larger on your screens at home, folks. Oh, well, you did it yourself, Steph. So the top. So this is my estimate of the district size in all the districts. So if you go to the one far on the left, there you go. So that's District 26. See the 26 is down below. There you go. And the population estimate I'm making is about 44,000. So if you have to have, what did I say, 48.5, I think, something like that on the one before.
49.5.
49.5. So if you have to have 49.5, that district is way below. What does that mean? It means that district is going to have to get, the boundary lines are going to have to get larger in order to gather in that additional 5,000 or so people, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at those districts, almost all of those districts on the left-hand side are rural districts. Most of them are northern districts, except around Kootenai County, or they are, kind of central Idaho districts, or some of the kind of southeastern Idaho districts. All of those districts are going to have to get bigger in terms of the actual geographic size. If you look at way over on the right, you'll see the districts that are above the amount. So the idea, the maximum I'm estimating to be, what was it, 54.5, I think, or some 54,000, 54.5, something in there. Okay. I'm estimating my district, District 14, which is Eagle and North Meridian, to currently be at least 73,000 people. It could be much higher. It could be higher than that. It could be 75, 76,000. Because the growth is so rapid. That's way over. I mean, that's literally almost 20,000 people over. What does that mean? It means that district is going to have to get smaller in geographic size, and a lot of those people are going to wind up being put into another district, right? So there's a lot of shifting that's going to go around here. Ada County is almost certainly going to get at least one more district. Canyon County is likely to get most of another district. Kootenai County the same. And then a lot of the rural counties are going to have to get combined even more than they already are in order to get to the population deviation standard. So there's clearly going to be some shifting, and most of that shifting has to be from rural to urban areas. Mm-hmm. So that's the big issue that will be before the Redistricting Commission next year.
That's a lot of moving around.
It is a lot, and we experienced the same thing in 2011, 2012. We saw this kind of growth last time. And so this is, this kind of trend has been going on now for a while, and it happened a little bit in the 90s, but especially in the 2000, 2010 period, and now again, we're going to see some major shifts. That's the nature of the beast, and this is true. This is happening in a lot of Western states. One of the other things I want to mention about Western states that's very different is that is we've already pointed out they're large, but Western states tend to have their population centered much more concentrated in a handful of larger urban areas. Yeah. And the rural areas tend to be much more spread out. If you think about, the Midwest, for example, in Ohio, for example, you've got Cleveland, you've got Cincinnati, you've got Dayton, but there's a million little towns all over the state. I mean, you can't go more than 5 miles without some kind of small community, right?
Right.
That's not true in the West, especially in the Intermountain West. A lot of that has to do with water, frankly. You know, if you look at the map of Idaho, almost the entire population is within 10 or 15 miles of the Snake River. It's amazing, you know. So what this means is that this disparity of districts between urban, suburban, and rural is even greater in the West than it is elsewhere. I mean, you think about the state of Washington. You've got Spokane, you've got Seattle, Tacoma, and then you've got this vast area in between where there's not a great deal of people, right? Look at Oregon. You know, Oregon's the same way. You've got this whole part of Oregon that wants to become part of Idaho at this point because they feel disenfranchised, as it were, because of this urban-rural divide. Well, that's true look at Nevada, for Pete's sake. Nevada is the prime example of this. You have the Reno area, Washoe County?
Washoe.
And you've got Clark County in Las Vegas area. And then you've got basically nothing else in between. My recollection is there are 21 senators in Nevada, and all but 3 of them represent either Washoe or Clark County.
Yeah, I think it's well over 80% of the state's population is in those 2 counties.
Yeah. Same thing is true in Phoenix. You got Phoenix, in Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson, right? New Mexico. Yeah, it's a very common Western phenomena that you don't find in very many other places.
Well, I would contend that's in large part also driven by the presence of the public lands where
exactly. That's right. Exactly.
You can't live in the
between water and public lands, you've got this very skewed distribution of population in the Western states compared to anywhere else. And so that it makes this even more complicated in the West. The other thing that makes this particularly complicated in the West, in Idaho, is Idaho is a very weirdly shaped state. I mean, it's probably the oddest shaped state, other than possibly Florida, of any state. And what that means is that when you start this redistricting process in Idaho, given all the public lands, given the skewed distribution of the population, it means if you start in the north, which is usually where you start drawing these lines and coming down north to south and then going west to east, trying to, it's kind of like a Rubik's Cube, trying to build all these blocks of equal population into the districts, keeping in mind counties at the same time. By the time you get to, eastern Idaho, you're trying to fit some really odd county shapes into districts, and they don't always fit. And so that's one of the reasons we wind up with lawsuits. And it's one of the reasons that some of the districts, particularly on the east side, tend to look pretty bizarre. I liken it to painting the kitchen floor and painting yourself into a corner where you've got nowhere to go, it's a very difficult, and I don't know that there's a solution to that. It's a function of the population distribution, the public lands, and the odd shape of the state of Idaho.
Well, I'm certainly glad I won't be one of those people trying to figure out how to solve that. I was rotten at the Rubik's Cube, and I'm pretty sure I'd be rotten at figuring this out too.
It's a fascinating process, but you're right, it's a very difficult process. One of the things I'll mention is that the commission always sets up computer sites in most of the major libraries in the state, so people can, they'll release all the data that shows the figures per county. It shows it everything down to the census block, census tract line. So you're all the way down to basically street level, so to precinct level and beyond. So you can see the population distribution, and you can see the demographic makeup of those districts, because you have to keep in mind issues of racial and ethnic equity as well. And so, and then of course, if you're into it, you can look at the partisan distribution down to the precinct level by looking at voter turnout and how people have voted per party. So it's people can actually draw their own lines. And in the last redistricting cycle, there were, I think, 120 or something proposals that were put out there. So, you know, if we're still in a pandemic situation, I anticipate thousands of plans because people have nothing else to do but to sit around and work on it. Hopefully, we won't be at that point.
A new hobby is launched. I love it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, Gary, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. I so appreciate it, and keep enjoying that retirement. And
I will indeed.
And give my best to Heidi and to Stephen, the other Dr. Moncrief, and of course Claire. And I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Steph.
Bye-bye.
That was way more than you want.